We're at a point in society where people are trying to find meaning for things where sometimes there is no meaning.
There are things I can't change. There are things I don't know. There are things I can't know. You know, big news, big media was all in on the Vietnam War until they weren't.
It all boils down to who has the most money.
Wait a minute. So if that's true, and you've been lying about that, what about all this stuff over here?
Conflict generates more views.
Their algorithms are tuned to increase disagreement.
Does TikTok come across Wi-Fi?
Most people my age and older, which is a lot of the legislators, they don't know anything about technology. It's scary. It's media manipulation, but there's vested interests in driving people against one another.
The other way is say, hey, you're a dipshit.
And shut up.
And shut up! If we don't do something about it, how bad can it get? I'm Brett Johnson, former United States Most Wanted Cybercriminal, now good guy, and host of The Brett Johnson Show. Today's episode, we're talking to Andrew V. Edwards. He's an author, he's a futurist, he has also got a nice company that trains on disinformation called Verity 7. We're going to talk to him about that. Now, why am I talking to Andrew today? The reason is when I was a criminal, I refer to myself as a criminal, still just one that doesn't commit crime. But when I was an active criminal, one of the things I used to teach my criminal peers was the perception of truth is not as important as the truth itself. Facts don't matter. What matters is what you can convince someone of. Now, when I got caught by the United States Secret Service, and as I was ripping them off, and then finally went off the run and escaped prison and all that stuff, one of the things I taught law enforcement, and I still teach today, and I have this saying that continues on, is the perception of truth is more important than truth itself. Facts don't matter. What matters is what you can convince someone of. Andrew reached out to me the other day, and I looked at his profile, saw that he was an expert in disinformation, saw that he was also a philosophy major. So I thought it would be a really good conversation to talk about the nature of truth, and then go over into disinformation, especially disinformation online, how it is destroying trust across the planet right now and the dangers of that, and how his company, Verity 7, helps to identify disinformation, train people on how to spot it and what to do about it. Now, before we get to that point, we're going to do a little news from the headlines. All right, so from the headlines, I was watching the news yesterday. So those who know me, you know I start out my morning by watching Fox News and CNN so I can start my day off pissed off at everyone. So I was watching CNN yesterday, and they were talking about how Trump is, and here's the thing, let me preface this by saying, I am not a Trump fan nor a Trump hater. I am an equal opportunity hater. I don't like either side anyway, any day. But the story yesterday was how Trump is trying to argue that the president is immune from prosecution. And one of the arguments that was put forth in court, the judge asked one of Trump's attorneys that, hey, so you're telling me that Trump could order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate one of his political rivals, and unless he was impeached first, he's immune from prosecution? And the lawyer answered, that's a qualified yes. Now, here's the thing. We are in a society now where a lot of individuals, not all, but a lot of individuals, they take sides. Left wing, right wing, middle wing, whatever wing that is. They take sides, and no matter what the argument is, they tend to support that argument no matter how irrational or insane that argument may be. We've got to start thinking rationally and logically, instead of letting dogma and emotion come in and dictate our beliefs. When we set reason to the side is when things start to go awry. On today's Art of Accountability segment. So you guys know that a lot of the Brett Johnson Show is about me learning how to become a better person than I've been, because let's be honest, I spent a lot of my life not being a good guy. Now I work diligently every single day to try to protect people and businesses from that type of person that I used to be. I also try to find out new things about myself constantly. That's one of the reasons that I appeared on the Jordan Peterson Show a few weeks back. The Brett Johnson Show, we're doing this segment called The Art of Accountability, and I'm giving little tidbits on what I think is important on how you can live healthy, better, be a better person overall, because at the end of the day, if we can just wake up and every day try to be just a little bit better than we were the day before, I don't think that's a bad thing. So today, we're taking a bit from the Serenity Prayer. So for those who don't know, the Serenity Prayer, there are like 16 different variations of it. The most common is used in Alcoholics Anonymous as part of the recovery program. And it goes, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Think about that for a second. The serenity to accept the things I cannot change. We live in a society, and Lord knows I've been guilty of that myself, being that control freak that I am. We want to control everything in our environment, and when we can't, when a lot of people can't, it results in anxiety. And that's what this prayer is saying. Grant me the serenity, because serenity is the exact opposite of anxiety. When you're presented with a situation, something's going wrong in your life, it's important to take that situation in the moment. Anxiety, if you're experiencing anxiety at the same time, that gets you out of the moment. It gets you thinking about the past, the potential future, instead of taking that situation in the moment, considering it, thinking about it, causing the feelings about it, and then finally the actions about it. You're catastrophizing. You're thinking about the past or something like that, and that's influencing your thoughts, your feelings, and then finally your actions at the end of the day. So the prayer is talking about, hey, grant me the serenity. Grant me the serenity to understand that, hey, there are things in this world, in this society, that we cannot change. We cannot control everything. And that's a hard pill to swallow sometimes, understanding that we live on a planet where we do not have control of every single facet of our lives. But we need to understand that. We need to understand there's a difference between what we can control and what we cannot control. We need to accept those things that we cannot control and understand that if we can't control it, we should not let it control us. So that's what we're talking about, is being able to accept that, being able to have the courage to act on the things that we can control. So you've got this manager at your job, and the manager is a hard ass. The manager is a bit of an asshole sometimes. Doesn't treat you right sometimes. It's important to understand that you can't change that person. You're never going to be able to change that person. But what can you do? You can control the way that you respond. You can control whether you continue to work at that job or you start making moves to find another job. So there are aspects of that situation that you can control. Understand that when you're looking at a situation like that, a lot of people, I've heard this saying, these absolutes of, he always treats me bad, or she always does this. Well, no, that's an absolute. An absolute is a thinking error. It's important to take things in the moment, to consider, okay, most of the time, maybe even sometimes, maybe 90% of the time, this manager or this relationship is very negative to me, but it's not constant. You have to take things in the moment, be truthful, be objective, be able to set aside, as we talked about the news from the headlines, be able to set aside your emotions and your dogma or your biases and consider things as objectively as possible as they're happening in the moment, and then have the courage to act on that and have the wisdom to know the difference between the two, to understand what you can control and what you cannot control. if you can do that, if you can get to that point, and one of the ways that you do this is to recite this prayer. And here's the thing, I am not a religious person. I'm not. So you can cut the God out, you can put in higher power, you can put in whatever you want to in there. You can put Gumby in there if you want to. I don't care. But recite it every single day. And as you recite it, it will set the tone for your day. And the more you recite it, you'll start to put it into practice, and you'll start to adapt it to your daily way of life. And after a while, it becomes part of your life. That habit becomes a way of life, and you become a better person at the end of the day. And that is today's Art of Accountability segment. All right, so for today's Brett Johnson Show, we are talking to Andrew Edwards. He is an author. He is a philosopher. He is a tech guy that does a lot of work to combat disinformation. Without further ado, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Brett.
No, I appreciate it, man. And you know, we talked yesterday, and just that brief conversation that we had was absolutely amazing. You had reached out to me on LinkedIn. And, you know, I don't have a company that can benefit from yours, but I was thinking, you know, just to be able to talk to this gentleman about disinformation. Then I looked up your profile and I was like, oh, geez, the guy is a philosopher as well. This is going to be a really good conversation. So I would like to ask, one of the questions that I was asked when I was a freshman at university, and I was busy trying to plagiarize my way through class. One of the questions that a professor asked was, what is truth? So I'll ask you that.
Wow. Don't give me any easy ones.
Well, we argued about that for 3 or 4 days, and it was just, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So apart from the obvious, you know, truth is in the eye of the beholder, and everybody has their own personal truth and all that sort of stuff. That's one slice of it. That's one way to look at it. But for the purposes of the subject of, you know, what is disinformation versus what is information, let me just start off with a definition of disinformation, which is lies told in public on purpose, usually to achieve a nefarious end, most often characterized by the manipulation of persuadable populations.
Okay, I like that definition. How does that differ from, say, propaganda?
Propaganda is a little bit of a higher level, where it can contain shadings of information. It can contain true information. It can contain, like I said, shaded information that discloses some things and de-emphasizes others. And, you know, propaganda, much as disinformation has become, although disinformation is a more extreme version of it, propaganda, as I'm sure you know, is disseminated by nearly every faction on the planet, from left, center, right. Everybody's got their story to tell. So I liken propaganda more to, like, what is the story you're telling us? It's probably some of it's true and probably some of it's false, and there's a spectrum.
Okay.
Whereas I feel like disinformation is a little bit more of a hard demarcation, where someone is definitely lying and definitely for some kind of problematic purpose.
Okay.
That's the way I would see it.
Okay.
And just one more refinement on that. When we talk about truth versus disinformation, I feel like the gating item to define something as true versus not true is whether it can be, number one, independently verified. 2, whether it has some kind of internal qualifications inside the claim. So you were saying earlier about, grant me the serenity to know the difference, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a great way to start your day, frankly. Right. A little bit of cognitive therapy will be helpful for everybody. The point there is that you were alluding to understanding the difference between different modes of thought. And within that is the claim to qualifiers. So there are things that are more important than others, things that are less important than others, and nothing, we want to live our life in a world where we are making finer distinctions than we perhaps first think about making. So we come to things and want to make snap judgments. If we're honest with ourselves and honest with the facts on hand, we'll usually find that it's not black and white.
Right.
And when you can first understand that and accept your position within that spectrum, that's kind of like what you were alluding to. I think that is, number one, healthy for civil discourse, and two, healthy for the person who can recognize that they're living in a world full of qualifiers and there is no black and white. And therefore, things like, worship of celebrities, whoever they may be, or just taking for granted whatever anyone tells you without bothering to investigate it even a little bit.
Right.
These are problems. And of course, the big topic, these days is, disinformation in social media. The problem, of course, is where we used to have a limited amount of information sources, right? Mm-hmm. I'm talking about, before social media, there was, I don't know if you remember all this, but there was a great deal of consternation among the big media companies that, someday there'll be 500 channels. And what are we going to do with, well, there's actually 500 million channels now. And every one of them has the ability to reach everyone.
Right.
And therefore, you no longer have any of these sort of assumed guardrails or protections. And you really have to kind of investigate all the claims independently, kind of on your own. And that can be a real struggle. Most people do not have the bandwidth nor the desire to do that. And sort of the what I call the cadre of cynical manipulators that run disinformation campaigns globally, and there are many of them. They simply assume this, and they know that this is kind of an easy one. They just put the stuff out there in volume, and they rely on people's credibility and lack of time to investigate. And one further thing, they rely on what's called forwarding, which is kind of the way that a lot of this stuff ends up spreading. If you look back at the history of perhaps a Cambridge Analytica, for instance, back in the 2016, where, the GOP sent them the voter list and they figured out who were the people who were most persuadable to certain kinds of messages. They did that. And then they kind of relied on those people to forward the stuff to all of their friends.
Right.
That's how these kind of messages really take root.
Let me ask you something, because this is really interesting to me, and it goes back to this, the whole philosophy aspect of things. That allegory of the cave, where you've got the person who lives in this box, echo chamber, what have you.
Yeah. And
then they're presented with the actual truth, and they sometimes become violent about it. My question is, when we're looking at disinformation online, whether that comes from 4chan or Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, wherever that's coming from, why are people much more likely, or not all, but a certain demographic, much more likely to accept those stories as true or factual instead of the other stories where they're not doing the disinformation?
That's a very good question. It's a complicated situation, but I do think that what has happened is that the common messaging that we used to be subject to, and I use the word subject to because I'm not trying to say that common messaging was sacrosanct or correct or anything like that. What I am saying is that we had an environment where, frankly, there weren't that many media channels, right? You had the big newspapers. I mean, you had your local paper, but they usually published whatever AP or UPI sent them. And you had the, three big networks, and you had PBS, and not a whole lot else. You had radio stations, right? So, when I was very young, you'd turn on the TV and there would be a guy like Walter Cronkite, and he'd be telling you what happened that day. And whether you were in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, or Conshohocken, Pennsylvania, you were seeing Walter Cronkite, okay,
right.
or his his twin, Huntley Brinkley, whoever it was, Peter Jennings, whatever. It was the same message. We knew what the big headlines were because we were told what they were. Now, that I'm not saying that's the right way to do it or the fair way to do it, but it created a sense of a baseline where we all heard all this stuff all together, all at once, and then we reacted to it. Some of us hated it, some of us liked it, but there was an agreement that there were this, and this goes back to the whole disinformation thing. There was an agreement generally that there were certain things that we accepted as having actually happened.
Right.
Right.
And you're making sense there because you didn't have, it was more centralized. So online you're more decentralized with things.
Yeah, totally.
But back then you were more centralized with the news that you were getting, meaning I guess more eyes were on those people, more fact checkers or people to hold others accountable. And it seems we're not really like that online anymore.
No. The fact checking part has definitely gone by the wayside online. I think we were talking about this yesterday, that my position is that digital has piggybacked unfairly, I think, on the, what's the right word for it? The rectitude that was imparted to us by the fact that there were fact checkers at these news organizations, whether you agreed with them or not, whether they were perfect or not, whether they had a slant or not. No comment about that. Everybody has an axe to grind, right? But they refrained from total and utter fabulisms. They would not, for instance, let's use the moon landing, for instance. I don't know where you stand on that, but I think we went to the moon. I think it would have been more of a hassle. I think we went
to the moon, and I think the Earth is round as well. Like
although, things like that. It was only later when people started saying we couldn't have gone to the moon because this, because of that. There's no stars in the sky. All these things, they're not that hard to explain.
So you're not inclined to believe that Stanley Kubrick faked the moon landing.
I feel he did not, because I feel like it probably would have been harder to pull that off and get everybody to believe it for years and years and years, and to develop this entire program that had no point whatsoever and get 1,000 people sitting in a room with a bunch of monitors just for fun. No, I don't. I think that would have been just too much work.
That's fair. That's fair.
So my point is that we accepted these things as fact, and that doesn't mean that I'm saying that proves we went to the moon. It's that it tells you that we all, more or less all, accepted that these people were not habitual liars. And there's a guy that sure as heck looks like he's putting his foot on the moon right there.
Right.
And we kind of ran on those principles. Now we could say we shouldn't have gone. We should have spent the money on something else, or, some other thing, but we didn't doubt the basic facts that were put before us. And some would probably say, well, that was your weakness. You were being lied to. Well, maybe. And I don't really have a position on that. I know there was propaganda. When you look at the story of the Vietnam War, big news, big media was all in on the Vietnam War until they weren't, right? We were winning until they realized we weren't, right? So we were being fed a line, for sure. No,
you're right. I mean, there was there was the stories about the Gulf of Tonkin incident that finally McNamara, admits a lot of stuff in Fog of War, things like that. And, and you're absolutely right.
Yes. So there were any number of these kind of things. But I think what's changed is what I call the atomization of news, so that we didn't go from, 3 channels to 20 channels. We went literally from 3 channels to millions and millions of channels, none of them particularly verifiable.
Right.
And many, many of them purely focused on spreading disinformation. And it's very difficult to spot them until you kind of have a few techniques under your belt, and you also have the willingness and the desire to go beyond surface appearances,
No,
which is not universal.
So a couple of things, and just to get your feedback on that, I was talking to a gentleman. He's he's part of the administration over at the Certified Fraud Examiners, and this was a year and a half ago. I was speaking to him, and we were talking about conspiracy theories. And he says, I asked him, I was like, why are people believing these conspiracy theories that are out there? And his thought was, well, people, we're at a point in society where people are trying to find meaning for things where sometimes there is no meaning. And it's easier for them to accept a conspiracy theory because that gives them some answer for the questions that they're asking, instead of being able to accept that, hey, sometimes there's not an answer for these things. And
yes.
Go ahead.
I think you're absolutely right. One of the things we learn as we mature is that, again, going back to what you were saying before, there are things I can't change.
Right.
There are things I don't know. There are things I can't know. And it's best, it is a really good idea to get comfortable with that idea. If you require certainties, you find yourself falling for a lot of stories that give you easy certainties where there might not be any. And one of the things I would point out is that my personal belief is that one of the things that's driving belief in conspiracy theories is that there are so many new, rather baffling things coming out in the news. A good example is UFO disclosure.
Right.
Okay. You don't have to, never mind what I think about UFOs or where they come from or whatever. The fact is that for 75 years, the United States government made it seem like if you were a believer in UFOs, that you were some kind of lunatic and should be watched closely.
Right.
Now they're coming around saying, well, we actually have videos showing things behaving non-aerodynamically in ways that would kill any pilot that was in the vehicle, and we do not know what the heck they are.
Did you see and I don't know how we got on the segue, but did you see the jellyfish video that was released?
Not the jellyfish, no. I've seen a bunch of other ones.
That looks like a giant turd on the lens.
It's bizarre, right? I mean, it looks like this jellyfish that's flying over top of a military compound in Iraq. And it dives into water for 17 minutes, comes back out at a rate of speed that they can't clock. And I mean, you're right, for 75 plus years. I mean, since the Corona or Roswell incident.
Roswell, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So you have this situation now where people are being confronted with things that are kind of inexplicable, and they have no frame of reference for it.
There's the fish online right now that we're looking at.
Yeah, that looks like it's on the lens. It looks like a giant bug splatter.
Almost. It almost does. I don't know what to say about that one. I don't know what to say about any of them, to tell you the truth. Yeah. But
you're right. I mean, the government has been very good about discrediting anyone that has come out and said anything about it. They've destroyed careers. We've had very professional, very educated people talking about this
and now they're the same people. The same organizations are coming down and saying, well, maybe it's for real after all, which understandably is going to make people say, wait a minute. So if that's true and you've been lying about that, what about all this stuff over here?
Right.
And the knee-jerk reaction would be, well, you must be lying about a bunch of other stuff. Well, maybe not. But again, it all has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's where digital has made it harder, because there's so many fragments of information.
I mean, that's a really good point that you're making there. That idea that since you lied about one aspect, that poisons every single aspect that you've ever done. I mean, that's a really powerful thing. And it makes sense, because human beings are very good about doing that.
Yes. Once shy, twice, I forget the rest of it, but I think you know
right.
Once burned, twice shy, right?
How does social media platforms feed into that?
Well, they have a very interesting business model. which I'm not sure how many people know how it was, how the foundations of that were set. And I'll very briefly describe my understanding of it.
Okay.
Back in 1996, there was a law passed called the 1996 Communications Decency Act. And it was called Section 230. This section of that act specifically gave what were then known as bulletin boards, such as CompuServe and Prodigy and places like that. These are very primitive, pre-social media, one-directional bulletin boards where a CompuServe or maybe an AOL or somebody, they'd have literally an electronic bulletin board, just like a cork bulletin board at the coffee shop. You couldn't do anything except post something there, and that was it. There was no promotion. There were no ads. It was just a bulletin board, like Craigslist. So kind of. And so Congress, understandably, wanted to protect those companies from liability. If some fool put up some, libelous, let's murder so-and-so sort of thing, right? And that person turned up dead. They wanted to shield those people from that, which made sense at that time. Well, years later, probably close to 20 years later, here comes social media, maybe 15 years later, social media, the big platforms, Facebook and Google with YouTube and X, which was then known as Twitter.
Right.
They took that loophole and they said, well, guess what? We're going to say we're a bulletin board.
Okay.
And we're going to say that we're not liable for anything that anyone posts on our platform, no matter what it is, no matter where it comes from, doesn't matter. And you know what? The Supreme Court has upheld that.
Okay. Now, wait a second, because you gave an example yesterday when we were talking on the phone that really puts this into perspective. Mm-hmm. And you were talking about if this were to happen in the brick and mortar world. Right. Yes.
So one of my favorite pastimes actually is to propose some of these internet behaviors, but take the computer out.
Right.
And say, what is this? What would really be going on? How would we think about this if this were a brick and mortar company doing the exact same thing, but without a computer? How would we feel about that? So the example I used was let's say we take the New York Times, and the reason I'm using that is because there's almost no other newspapers out there anymore, right? So I'm going to use them as the poster child for all print media.
All right.
so they're located in New York City. They have an office in Times Square. Let's say they opened up a storefront in Times Square, and they put a big billboard on it and said, anybody who wants to come in here and type up anything they want, we will take it. We will put it up on the New York Times website. Not only that, we will print it up on the New York Times presses. We will distribute these newspapers. Not only will we distribute them, we will find audiences for you. We will go around town with town criers saying, who is most interested in killing Big Bird? Because somebody posted, let's kill Big Bird. He doesn't like Big Bird, right? We will find all the people who want to kill Big Bird, and we'll make sure they read what you just said. And they go around and they do that. And then a week later, Big Bird turns up dead. Do you think that the New York Times might find themselves in a little bit of hot water in that situation?
Nah, not their fault.
Not their fault. Or for instance, what if it was CBS News? FCC would be all over them.
Right.
Their license would be just about revoked right on the spot. But here we have these social media companies who are neither fish nor fowl, according to them. Although I say they're publishers straight up. I don't think they're anything but they will say we are not publishers because we don't create any of this content. Well, yes, but you have created a global, vertically integrated distribution and monetization system, which you, by the way, Mr. and Mrs. Platform, have made trillions of dollars off of somehow. I refuse to accept that is not on purpose.
I agree. I mean, it's and as you're explaining this, it's occurring to me that it all boils down to who has the most money. is what it seems like to me. I mean,
well, these days it always has. I think.
Yeah, it always has. But you've got Meta, you've got X, you've got whatever other social.
Well, Google with YouTube is
Google
huge.
with YouTube is huge.
Yeah.
And here's what really gets me. You're absolutely right. If it were a newspaper and someone posted something like that to advocate the murder of someone or violence or pornography, illegal pornography, or whatever that is, drug trafficking, what have you.
Yep.
If it were a brick and mortar newspaper that did that, it would not last for long. Mm-hmm. Absolutely not. But because it's online, it's acceptable. But here's the thing that I'm thinking now that you've explained it like this. It really depends on who's posting it, on who's, allowing what on their platform. Because if you look back at something like, say, Silk Road 2010, Ross Ulbricht simply built a platform for people to come in and advertise whatever they wanted to for sale. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And come to find out, all the advertisers were selling illegal stuff, but he got life in prison for that.
Right.
Meta is very good, and I've talked about this for years now, since I came over to the good side, but Meta is very good about harboring illegal content online. I can go on Facebook at any point, do a keyword search for stolen credit cards or checks or identity information, and I will find countless Facebook groups that Meta does not take down. Mm-hmm. And talking to some insiders from Meta, they typically say, well, you know what, if we take that down, it makes we're scared. The lawyers are scared they'll become liable for the rest of it, which I guess feeds into this whole idea of them arguing, hey, we're not creating the content. We are not publishers. We're hands off. We're just allowing people to come onto the platform and disseminate this garbage that's here.
I believe they feel like that is their inoculation. And so far they've been right. It has been. They've been able to monetize all kinds of information, much of it disinformation, right? A fair portion of it. And I don't really even interact with Facebook very much at all, but a fair amount of it probably illegal. Right. And certainly distasteful and would not pass muster at almost any other major media company. But because they present themselves as a sort of, it's a publicly held company with pretensions to be good for society,
right? To
be connecting people, to be facilitating communication. That is what they present to the world. But I think by this time, most people know what they're really up to. But the thing is, they got themselves in a position where, yes, they are the big player in the room, and it's going to be very difficult to dislodge them because of the amount of money they have. Right. But I think even more importantly, frankly, Section 230 just simply absolves them.
You're right.
There was a case recently called Gonzalez versus Google, which was an incident, which was a case that was upheld by the Supreme Court, affirming the non-liability of Google. And in this case, centered around the murders at the Paris nightclub a few years ago, where ISIS murdered a bunch of innocent people at a nightclub in Paris. And one of them happened to be the daughter of an American, a guy named Gonzalez.
Right.
He sued Google and said, Google, I believe you are a proximate cause. And that's a common tort term, by the way.
Okay. You
didn't do it, but you helped do it, or your energies contributed to it. So he's saying you are a proximate cause to my daughter's wrongful death. I believe that you need to compensate me because you were in some way, shape, or form contributing to her demise.
Right.
And the reason they said that is because YouTube, which is a property of Google, disseminated and located and inculcated vulnerable possible ISIS members to become radicalized into the ISIS ideology, and then turn them loose in Western society to go and murder people. And Google's putting this out there, promoting it, selling ads around it. Okay. And then this guy comes along and sues them, and the Supreme Court says, sorry, you're out of luck.
But I mean, you're right in what you're saying. I mean, you look at the YouTube algorithm, it absolutely will feed you that type of content. There's no doubt about it. Absolutely.
That's what it's designed to do.
Right.
Now, what they'll say is that it's not designed, their defense of it will be, well, it's not designed to distribute nefarious content. It's designed to give you more of what you said you were interested in.
See, that's not true, though. That's absolutely not true, because we know that conflict generates more views, more engagement.
Yeah, this is one of their dirty secrets. Their algorithms, and they're not going to admit this, but we know that their algorithms are tuned to increase disagreement.
Right.
They know that conflict generates eyeballs.
Right.
And the more conflict there is, the more arguing, the more outrage there is in the outrage industrial complex. The more of that there is, the more time people will spend on site, the more ads they can sell. It's very simple.
Okay,
Brett, we need to get more outrageous on this show.
Is that what we need? So, going back, and I didn't set it up like this with a serenity prayer. I did not. But looking at Section 230, looking at how the Supreme Court has basically sat there and said, hey, use social media platforms, you're good to go.
Good to go.
Looking at that, is this one of these moments where we have to accept the things we cannot change?
I'm going to say no. And the reason I'm going to say that is because it's a law. Laws can be changed.
Right.
But we need a constituency that will push legislators to do that. It's not going to be easy, but I have a feeling like it might even be a bipartisan issue. Like
it might. I mean, I don't know why the hell it wouldn't, but I got to tell you now, I remember looking at those, watching some of the hearings on cryptocurrency, where they were trying to explain to all of our lawmakers what it was, and they had these blank looks like. And then I remember them interviewing the TikTok guy. And they asked the TikTok guy, one of them said, hey, does TikTok come across Wi-Fi? And I was sitting there going, holy shit, man.
We're in trouble.
We're in trouble. So if we're looking for educated policies or law changes, I don't know.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right about that. Certainly in 1996, when they wrote these laws, they had no idea what they were doing. You may remember the guy who said the internet is a series of tubes.
Yes.
So
the internet is not something that you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of tubes.
We've come a long way since then, but we're still, the legislators, octogenarians all, are slowly catching up. But there's, one of the things that I recall saying was that, and I'm trying to remember which case this was, but the Supreme Court was saying, and this is not even one of the conservative members, one of the liberal members said, we're not really internet experts here. We're not the greatest. And I'm thinking to myself, well, then you need to recuse yourself from this case, because this is about the internet. If you don't understand the issues, you can't be making law about it. And I think this is a problem with a lot of our legislators. They flat out do not understand the technology, period.
Right.
So for them to suss out like what is going to be an effective way to deal with these things, we're hoping for things that probably won't happen unless we start to get, and this is happening, younger people into the legislature.
Right.
People who grew up with this technology understand it natively. They whereas, God bless them, the older folks, and I'm not that young myself, but I was early in tech for since the 1990s. But most people my age and older, which is a lot of the legislators, they don't know anything about technology. It's scary.
I mean, you're right. You're absolutely right. So let me ask you, and I want to move over into what Verity 7 does, but before we get there, you looked me up, so you know I'm a former criminal. And one of the things that I really say and I believe in is that someone like me, we don't change unless something forces us to change. There has to be a catalyst for that to happen. And I'm thinking the same thing applies to something like Section 230. What catalyst could possibly happen to precipitate that law change?
That is a good question. I don't know if there's a single thing. I'd almost be reluctant to have it happen because it would have to be pretty extreme.
Right.
And I even then, I don't know if the connections would be made. I think that what is going to be needed is a targeted lobbying effort, frankly, with like-minded people putting their heads together and coming up with advocacy positions that can reach across the aisle and find enough of a constituency so that we can tackle this problem satisfactorily for the majority of people involved. And it's not going to be easy, but I think the evidence is so clear that at a certain point, if you publicize it in the right way and you get the right people on board and you frame it the right way, I think there's a chance, but I'm not going to say we're close to it. We're still quite a long way off. But I don't think that's any reason to not try. Every journey starts with one step, as they say.
I agree. So how bad if we don't do something about it? And this is going to springboard into Verity. But if we don't do something about it, how bad can it get?
What is the price of the loss of democracy? What is you know, we're getting to a point where you know, no secret. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, you know, stuff like civil war and a lot of talk about violence. And these are scary things, especially in a well-armed country.
300 million firearms. Yeah, we're well armed.
Yeah, right. And the thing is, the economic pain is not there. We're not a country of starving people who are fighting over crusts of bread. I mean, you know, people got car payments and all this kind of stuff. And so I don't know, maybe that'll keep them from losing it. But frankly, you look at why this is happening. It's, to me anyway, it's not some kind of hardship that's generating the extremism. It's manipulation. It's media manipulation and people looking for some kind of monetary gain, either by grifting or they're just going to advertise over the outrage or whatever. But there's vested interests in driving people against one another.
Right. So you seeing this, you recognizing this, Verity 7.
So, this is a company that I started only this year. I mean, I have a background in technology consulting. I'm a founder of the Digital Analytics Association. For many years, I helped large organizations understand their digital traffic and what it meant to their companies. I won't mention the names, but you probably recognize some of the household names that I work with to help them, really understand what their audiences were interested in, and help them to better supply content for those audiences. Right. And you'll notice a similarity there, right? The company A wants to please their customer. They understand that type of customer is clicking on XYZ. Well, let's do more of XYZ. Right. It sounds a little bit like what Facebook is doing.
A little bit.
You said you wanted to see more of the beheading videos. Well, here's some more beheading videos for you. So knowing how all that worked, I started to figure raw analytics is great, but the societal impact of disinformation is so crucial that I feel like I wanted to contribute to people's ability to deal with it and their organization's ability to deal with it before they encounter it. And what I came up with was this idea that we could train people so that they would be prepared to deal with disinformation should they find themselves the victim of it. And I located a company in Germany called Prevency, P-R-E-V as in Victor, E-N-C-Y.com in Germany, that created a SaaS-based immersive training environment where we spoof social media. We put fake disinformation in there based on a conversation with the client. What would really push your buttons, right? Let's put some of that in there and have it roll into this training environment and have the participants at the organization respond to it in real time and learn lessons about how you deal with stuff without making it worse.
Nice. Nice.
And essentially that, in a nutshell, that is what Verity 7 does. I mean, there's a lot of philosophy around it and stuff, but that is the deliverable.
That's really interesting because, the weak link is always the human being. Always. Yep. And so I'm looking at, I know Stu Showerman over at Know4 phishing simulation company. And one of the things that you're doing, with phishing training is you consistently are there training those employees. It's something that's active and that's constant all the way throughout. Yes. And it makes a huge difference. It truly does. You doing this with disinformation, I'm assuming that the program itself is something that it's not, a 3-hour program. It's something that takes place consistently across the board.
Yes. The session itself is not very long, a couple hours, but there's prep time, talk, there's a lot of consulting involved, and there's follow-up and recommendations, et cetera, et cetera.
So you've seen this make a difference as far as the recognition of disinformation, and then how, once something is recognized, what happens at that point? Say the employee, we're training the employee to recognize disinformation. Once that person has recognized it as whatever it may be, racial or hate, what have you, what happens at that point?
Well, they would. So I think what you're describing would come early in the process, where I would discuss with a client, what is it that your organization feels especially vulnerable to?
Right.
And there's often enough, there's something that's already happened in my experience. And they'll just talk about that. And they'll say, well, why don't we design a program that leverages what you already experienced and expand on that and let you respond to it in real time? So I will take that information and set up a basket of fake news items, if you will, and literal disinformation on purpose. And then I hit the button, it starts to roll into our exercise, and the person reads it and says, so-and-so is doing something bad and they're not who they say they are. And then they have to figure out, well, how am I going to answer this without sounding like presumptuous or disrespectful, or, you want to make the situation better, defuse it, promote the truth, and not get into a big argument over nothing. Right. And it's not as easy as it sounds, because it's easy to take offense and to get into the weeds. And,
it comes back to, if you've got somebody now, not a bot, because we know bots are doing this.
Yeah.
But if you've got a human being that believes that disinformation that they're forwarding, like you talked about earlier, and then they're confronted with the truth, it comes back to that philosophy thing, that allegory of the cave, where a lot of people don't like being corrected.
This is true. And I would say that there's only a slim chance that you can actually convince the perpetrator that they were wrong.
Right.
But at least you can convince the million other people who they're trying to convince that they in fact may be the one that's wrong.
Right.
And that's valuable.
It is.
I don't hold much hope out for convincing the person who is the true believer. But there's a lot of people who are not really true believers. They're just like kind of passive. Right. And they'll believe more or less what is fed to them. And I think that represents a large percentage of the population.
No, and my hat's off to you, and much respect. And looking at Verity, I don't think there's really any other companies that are doing what you're doing right now with this.
I don't believe there are, at least not in the United States. It's interesting to note that the Prevency, of course, is a German company. They're in the EU. I've found that in the EU, generally, the notion of disinformation being a problem and that one should do something about it seems to be farther along in the EU than it is here.
It's weird, isn't it? Especially Germany. It's weird.
Yeah. Well, the dynamics are noteworthy.
Right.
They do not, one of the things that this is probably another total different topic, but like they don't really have a constitution the way we have. They have a lot of interlocking laws and understandings, but they don't have something like free speech absolutism.
Right.
They don't have a First Amendment. This is I'm all in favor of the First Amendment, but it is leveraged by people who try to say that any sort of correction of information is some kind of censorship. Right. Which is it's a clever tool to use, but it's totally inaccurate. There's correcting someone is not censorship.
Right.
That's a whole other topic. That's a whole other topic.
But I mean, you're right, though. Correcting is not censorship. Correcting is saying, hey, sometimes in a very nice way, you're mistaken. And here's enough data and facts and references and experts to show you why you're mistaken. And we have a nice, friendly conversation. So that's one way to do it. And the other way is say, hey, you're a dipshit,
and shut up.
And shut up, because everyone's opinion is not the same.
Right. Yeah, that one might not work so well.
It may not, but sometimes it has to be done that way.
That has to be done. That's true. That is true.
Okay, so Andrew, I love you, man. I think you're great, and
Thank you.
I absolutely love talking to you. You've written more than a few books.
Two books.
Bunch
of articles, bunch of other stuff, a couple of books.
The book that's coming out this September.
Yes, called Army of Liars. Same publishers as this one here, Digital is Destroying Everything. But Army of Liars is much more about disinformation in social media, much as we have been talking about. Whereas Digital is Destroying Everything was more about digital trends in general. And it did predict a bunch of stuff that came true quicker than I thought it would, which is why my publisher agreed to publish the second book.
Outstanding. So Digital Trends is the first one. That's available now.
Digital is Destroying Everything.
Digital is Destroying Everything.
Right there.
Gotcha. So, and the second one, Army of Liars, is due out in September. So here's the thing. For my listeners out there, I've talked before about why attacks happen because of status, cash, ideology. When we're talking about disinformation, there are a few things more important on the planet than this idea of disinformation versus the truth. Disinformation is something that poisons the entire well of the internet. We will get to the point where we do not trust anything that we see or read, and that becomes very dangerous. And we'll get to the point where we do trust the things we shouldn't be trusting because a friend said it, a family member said it, someone in power or authority or someone that was rich said it, and we follow by that. Andrew Edwards is a professional and an expert when it comes to disinformation. He understands the problems that are going on out there. I urge you to pick up both of these books. Digital is Destroying Everything, and this September, Army of Liars. More importantly, if you are a company, if you're an employee of a company, I urge you to reach out to Verity 7 and undertake some of this disinformation training. It matters. It matters. If we do not take a proactive stance and start doing what we need to do to secure trust online, we can't wait around for Congress or the Supreme Court to do it for us. So
we're going to have to do the heavy lifting ourselves.
We absolutely are. Andrew, if people need to reach out to you and contact you, how do they do that?
They can go to Andrew@verity7.com, or they can go to www.verity7.com.
Andrew@verity7.com or www.verity7.com. Andrew Edwards, absolutely outstanding. Thank you so much for coming on.
Glad to be here.
No, I appreciate it, truly. So we're going to close things out. That being said, remember, Don't sit on your ass waiting for someone or something to do it for you. Understand what you have the power to change, how you are always in control of the way that you respond to things. That's one of the lessons of the day. I'm Brett Johnson. This is the Brett Johnson Show. We are going to close things out. How do we do that? We do it the same way every single time. Stay safe, stay secure, stay vigilant. More importantly, this is the Brett Johnson Show. At the end of the day, just do the right damn thing. I'm Brett Johnson. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Andrew Edwards, for coming on. Until next time.